Welcome to episode 68 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning talking to you here from my house in southeast London, though we are talking of moving, actually. The proximity to airports and the big smoke is becoming less and less appealing. It's February 2023. This is the first episode of the month. If this is the first time you've listened to the podcast, welcome. You have about an hour or so. In fact, this one's a bit longer than an hour or so. It's about an hour and a half. And I did toy with making this a double episode, but I decided, just get it all out in one. So it'll be an hour or so, or an hour and a half in this case, of film history chat ahead of you. Please do check out some or all of the previous 67 episodes. You've missed some really good ones. I've enjoyed all of them, actually. I don't think I've had a dud guest yet. I was the guest on it once. Maybe that's probably my least favourite. If you're a regular listener, you know the law of the podcast. Thanks as always for your continued support. If you do like my work, and this is work, albeit work that I love, is often the line that I say, then please visit patreon.com/Jamie Benning. There are several tiers to choose from. And welcome to my two new recent patrons. Your support is very much welcome. You can now also support the podcast by buying some Filmumentaries merch, including Filmumentaries logo mugs, t-shirts, bags, bottles, and even socks. Also t-shirts with Inside Jabba and Inside Jaws posters on them. I was thinking of doing one for Raiding the Lost Ark and Star Wars Begins, so I'll have a look at that, see what artwork I've got. All that and more can be found at filmumentaries.creator-spring.com. I'll leave both the links I've just mentioned in the show notes so you can find them easily. Thanks for the feedback on the Jean Bolte episode. She was and is great, and you can find that episode along with all the others on Apple, Google, Amazon, Spotify, or any of your regular podcast apps. And please do remember to share with like-minded film nerds. There are more out there. Okay, so for this episode, number 58, I spoke with an animator at ILM, namely Hal Hickel. Now, if you're on Twitter, you'll know that Hal is a prolific tweeter. I've had a number of conversations with him online, and recently, in one conversation, it transpired that Hal had done some of the work on the 2004 version of Star Wars, A New Hope to some of you, particularly on the redone Jabba scene, which was in itself a redo of the 1997 special edition release. My friend Drew of Star Wars Visual Comparisons, do check out his Twitter and his site. He goes into major depth about all the difference between the versions of the films, and he's the world's leading expert on all this stuff. Saw that we were talking about this, it's something that we've talked about for a while, and he was in on the conversation. So I thought, why don't I approach Hal to come on the podcast and talk about that scene as well as many of the other films he's worked on over the years. Looking at my notes here for the keywords that I'll add to the podcast upload, we talk about Toy Story, Jurassic Park, Rogue One, The Life Aquatic, and many, many more in between. So here's my chat with Hal Hickel, visual effects animator, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. Hal, so I read that age 12, you were a kid who wrote a letter to Lucasfilm outlining a sequel, but where did the love for Star Wars first begin? Was it that first 1977 showing in your local cinema?
Yeah, absolutely. I was 12 or 13, I guess, so spring of 77, so it would have been 12, actually. I think sometimes I've said 13 to people, but when I think about it, I was actually 12. I turned 13 later that summer. And we lived in a little tiny town in Colorado that was not close to any movie theater. So it was quite it was a good hour or more drive for us to get to a theater. But we would make it down for big event films like Jaws, for instance, or, Close Encounters, films like that.
Did you see Jaws when you were 10?
Yeah.
Really? Yeah.
And we were, again, I was in Colorado, so I was pretty much as far from the ocean as you could be. But we had a lake on our property, and I just couldn't go swimming in it. While there's no rational reason, I certainly knew there were no sharks in it. But
I was scared of the bath afterwards.
But we made the trek down to the same theater, actually, to see Star Wars. It was a big Cinerama theater, so a big curved screen. And my recollection was we got there a little late and we had to sit quite close to the fronts, not maybe in the front row, but, closer than my parents would have liked. And so that opening shot of the Star Destroyer overhead, it was extra impressive for 12-year-old me because I was already interested in stop motion and filmmaking at that point. I was had a Super 8 camera. I was making little stop motion films at home. But that film really just brought my whole interest in visual effects into all the areas, miniature photography, matte painting, when I would read about it afterwards, because I wanted to know how did they do the chasm inside the Death Star where Obi-Wan turns off the tractor beam? How did they do Luke's land speeder? How did they do the lightsabers? How did they, I wanted to know all of it. And so it really just kind of took me from being interested in one specific little aspect of special effects, stop motion, and got me interested in special effects generally, and actually filmmaking generally. Because prior to that, I would say I was interested in filmmaking, but not as seriously as I became after Star Wars, where I really started to think more about how films were structured and edited, things like that, than I hadn't really considered before. So, yeah.
And then you wrote this letter to Lucasfilm famously. Explain that.
I read that they were going to make a sequel, and so I helpfully sent off my by then I think probably 13-year-old ideas on what the sequel should be, with a request to work on it myself and offer my services,
Nice.
for free if needed. And I got back a very kind reply from, of all people, the producer's assistant, Buddy Alsop, which at the time didn't impress me. I was just a little let down that they didn't want to use my story. But, later years, I kept the letter, of course. In the later years, I would look at it and think, well, now how in the heck did the producer's assistant have time to reply to fan letters? I mean, there must have been deluge with fan letters, truckload must have been coming in from all over the world. And I actually had the pleasure of at least meeting Bunny years later. Actually, I ran into her on LinkedIn, of all places. I told her the story. She was really tickled by it. And she said, well, that was something she enjoyed doing. And she did as much of it. She replied to as many fan letters as she was able to up until they had to leave for England for filming of Empire Strikes Back. And then she had to hand it all off to whoever ran the fan club or whatever. But so I was just super fortunate. And then letterhead has a nice, here,
How's off to get the letter?
I really should just have this thing ready when if I'm talking to people about this. But it's on this nice Ralph McQuarrie letterhead.
Oh, the old Ralph letterhead logo. Yeah, that's great.
And it's typewritten. It's not printed. It's she rolled the paper into a typewriter and typed it up for me. Anyways, years later, when we were having a wrap breakfast for Phantom Menace, George was there, and people started bringing up little bits of things for him to sign, which is not something anyone would ordinarily do when working with him. But this was kind of a celebration, and he seemed very good-natured about it. And so Rob Coleman, who was the animation director on the prequels, said, oh, go, because I had this letter hanging in my cubicle. He said, go get that letter and have it. And I was like, no. And I was like, yeah, he'll enjoy it. So I got it. And one of the things the letter says is getting into movies requires a certain combination of talent and luck. And so George, I put the letter down and he read it and kind of chuckled and he underlined talent and luck and wrote, you have it, and then signed it.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Closing the circle for me after 13-year-old me. Anyways.
That's great. I got to meet George once. I didn't ask him for his autograph. Stupidly. I should have done. In fact, I've seen him a few times because he's a motorsport fan, of course. So I used to see him on the Formula One quite a lot. And one day I just approached him. He was very sweet, and we had a little chat. But anyway, this is not about me. But then your next step was what? To try and get into a school that was film related?
Yeah, there was a terrific article about the visual effects on Star Wars, actually, and Close Encounters in a magazine called Cinefantastique, and it was a double issue. And it's funny because I've run into various people, John Knowles, one of them, over the years, who have that same issue still have the copy they had, like I do, old dog-eared and worn, because it was such a good article, and it had so much good information in it, especially for the time period, pre-Cinefx, pre-internet. Anyways, and one of the great things about the article was that they did interviews with lots of people on the crew, not just not just Dykstra and one or two others, but all kinds of people. And one of them was Adam Beckett. Adam Beckett had headed up the animation effects on the film, so lightsabers, laser blasts, things like that. And he in fact, he had animated himself all the little electrical arcs that crawl over R2 when the Jawas zap him. And that shot really caught my eye and piqued my interest. And so in his little interview, he mentioned, it was mentioned that he had gone to the California Institute of the Arts in Valencia, California. It's about 45 minutes north of LA. So I set my sights on going there. And unlike a sensible person who would prepare a portfolio and send out applications to a bunch of schools, hoping that they'd get into one of them, I just sent stuff to Cal Arts, hoping that's it. I just put all in one basket and fortunately, I got in because I didn't really have a plan B. I might have ended up working in a grocery store or something, which is fine. But I was fortunate, and I had a great mentor there. Jules Engel was my mentor at the school, and I was in the film graphics program. They have a sort of what people call the Disney school, because Walt Disney had a hand in setting it up, but which is sort of their character animation school. And I didn't go there because I was really more interested in visual effects than cartoon animation. So I went to what was called their film graphics program, and it was more experimental animation. It's great. It's a great school. It still is. And one of the great things about Cal Arts is that it's multiple disciplines. So, there's an acting, there's a drama school, there's fine arts, there's music, and live action filmmaking, animation. So, if you need voice talent for an animated film you're doing, you can go to the drama school. If you need music, you can go there and find a student who wants to collaborate with you. And you're just sort of immersed in all these, crazy people and their different areas of interest. So I loved it. It's a great school.
And that lines you up, doesn't it, for the sort of collaborative nature of what you ended up doing as well. And then
yeah, very, very much.
And you ended up working for an effects company early on in the 80s as well, didn't you?
Yeah, it was around the time when I left Cal Arts, I was very interested in this particular area of effects at that time. Nowadays, we just call it motion graphics, but it encompassed things like the slit scan Stargate sequence in 2001, but also stuff like I mentioned before in the animated effects on R2 and things like that. And so it straddled two worlds, the visual effects, but also sort of broadcast graphics. We're using a lot of those kinds of effects at that time to do these kind of glittering, shiny, streaky, luminous titles and things. And I was very interested in those processes. And it just happened that a shop had opened up back up in Portland where I was from and needed help. And a tiny little outfit. It was sort of 2 or 3 people at the time I joined. And so I went there, and it was a good first step. I was there for 4 years, which is really too long because I kind of got everything I could get out of that job in a couple of years. And I didn't like the boss very much. And so I kind of stayed there too long, but, lesson learned. But then what happened was right about the time I had a reel put together, I had some work under my belt. What I wanted to do was go back down to LA to work for bigger houses doing that same kind of work or visual effects companies or both, freelance around. But there had been a big transformation. This would have been, so I left Cal Arts in 83 and it was now 87, and a big transformation had happened in that whole area of broadcast graphics, and they'd stopped being done with photochemical motion graphics work and were now being done digitally. Some with proper 3D CG by then, but most of them with this kind of digital toolkit called an Ampex ADO, Ampex Digital Optics. And it made, to my eye, this kind of cheap-looking, harsh-looking digital graphics, but they could fly titles around and they would do these page turns and different effects. But they were all in this kind of turnkey hardware box that was sold by Ampex. And so all the pretty looking motion graphic stuff that I had seen and was inspired by was sort of gone. And it was this kind of other thing. And the companies were all moving chairs around and, shrinking and growing. Some were going out of business. Others were changing their business model, buying new equipment and all that.
Nice.
So it was a bad time I went down at one point, kind of shot my reel around, but it just was bad timing. But what was happening back up in Portland was Will Vinton Studios was blowing up. They were a stop motion studio. There had been before that quite tiny and unknown, but now they were doing the California Raisins commercials, which were kind of a blip on the cultural radar of the 1980s. And they were these little clay raisin characters singing Motown tunes, and it was advertising.
I remember them.
For the California Raisin Advisory Board, which sold raisins.
Was there like a longer version of those commercials? Because I'm sure here in the UK there was like a
we did
film version or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So right around the time I started, they were still doing commercial series, but then they embarked on several animated half-hour specials for ABC. So one of them was called Meet the Raisins, and it was sort of styled on it was a mockumentary, as if
That's right.
Beatles were sort of like, the Raisins were sort of like the Beatles, and they kind of charted their rise to success, etc. And then there was a second one called Raisins Sold Out, and then we continued to make some specials that weren't raisin related. We did a Halloween special called Comedy of Horror, Claymation Comedy of Horrors, and an Easter special. And an Easter special. So we did those four. I think we did any other. And then alongside those, we kept doing tons and tons of commercials, which was the bread and butter of the studio at the time. And so I was there for 6.5 years, and it was great. It was a nice, medium-sized studio. And we all learned from each other. And it was kind of fun, too, because we weren't really connected with the outside industry. We just sort of knew each other. And for a lot of us, it was our first real job. I had worked for that other studio prior, but that was all local advertising. It was a very tiny shop. And this was my first time working on stuff that was being seen by the outside world to a large degree and felt like a bigger deal. Like we did a raisin commercial with Michael Jackson, and we did, I don't know, there's things like that made it feel like a bigger deal than where I'd been. And it was fun to get back to stop motion because I'd done stop motion as a kid, but I'd never done it professionally. And so that was all good fun.
Did you have kind of half an eye still on the film industry and what was going on there and where you eventually wanted to end up?
I did. So I had shifted my goals from, that kind of motion graphics, animation effects world to now stop motion and creature work. And I thought, all right, fine. That all got taken over by computer effects. I'll now do creatures and I'll get good at stop motion. And as well, I immersed myself in the motion control equipment at the studio, such as it was at the time, which over the time I was there went from very primitive to pretty darn good by the end of it. Not because of me, but that just happened to be the evolution of it. Mm-hmm. But it was a good opportunity for me to learn how to operate motion control cameras and just learn the ins and outs of that kind of equipment and running that, because that was another tool or another way I could get into the visual effects industry, if not as a stop motion animator, then perhaps as a motion control cameraman shooting miniatures and things. So I was doing those two things with an eye still toward hopefully one day working at ILM, and that zeroed me back toward ILM because prior to that I still wanted to work there, but I had thought that LA was probably a better bet for me in terms of Los Angeles, in terms of the animated effects and motion graphics stuff, because most of the shops were down there, whereas ILM is up in San Francisco. But this kind of refocused me on ILM. So toward the end of my 6.5 years there in 90, or about midway maybe, in 90, when did Jurassic Park come out? 93 or 92?
93, yeah.
93. We were, as it happened, the studio was working on a spec test for a film called Dinosaur, which was later made by Disney using CG. But at the time, it had started its life as a project that Phil Tippett was going to do in stop motion. The script was written by Waylon Green, and it was being shopped around because I think Phil had to maybe because Jurassic Park came along or something, for some reason, it stopped being something he was going to do, and Disney started shopping it around to other stop motion companies and animation companies. So we were setting up this big elaborate set piece of the swamp with some triceratops and some other dinosaurs. Now, we were still doing clay animation at the time, but we were trying to make this look realistic-ish, but still kind of illustrative, I'd say, but more realistic than what our stuff normally looked like. Our stuff was normally pretty cartoony. But it was a big elaborate thing, and I wasn't working on it, actually. I was keeping an eye on it. I thought it was interesting. But I wasn't working. I was working on something else. But the film came out, and on the Friday it came out, I wasn't that busy that day, so I took off work in the middle of the day to go see a matinee of it. And we'd all been having conversations for weeks, months really, about the film. We'd all seen the trailers, and none of us knew anyone who worked at ILM or Stan Winston's who could tell us what was going on. But we'd read that, Stan's shop was working on it, ILM was working on it, and we'd read that it featured these computer-generated dinosaurs, and we would just look at the trailer and think, well, that can't be, you see like a foot in the mud. We're like, well, that has to be real. That's how it stands for. But then there's that shot where you're in the Jeep looking out, and the T-Rex legs just stomp past in the headlights, and we're like, why? God, do you think they could get a thing moving that fast and that fluidly, an animatronic? And right, but that can't be the computer graphics. I mean, not that close to we were just like, I don't know. So I went and saw it. I was completely stunned, just knocked out of my seat. And it was a whole mix of things because it was beautiful. I think I might have actually teared up when you saw all the herds down in the lake the first time, with the water, the sunlight glinting off the water.
And the John Williams music rising up. Yeah, it's
very pretty. After, a whole childhood of stop motion films and dreaming of realizing something like that. It was quite emotional. Anyways, so I get back to work, and I just went over to where those guys are working. I just said, just stop what you're doing. Put down your tools, go to the theater, whatever we all thought was possible. You really you have no idea. Just go. But as impressed and all as it was, it was a massive defeat, because I thought, well, that's it. I didn't think they'd be doing real life creatures. I thought stop motion was safe for a while, and that was my career path. And well, maybe I can still do the motion control camera thing. But if they're doing creatures I don't know. And then, so I just didn't know what my path forward was going to be. And then I just got a lucky break. Couple of years later, about a year later, mid '94 or fall of '94, I think. I heard a friend at the studio that Pixar, who I only knew for doing some commercials they'd been doing. Oh, and Lotso Jr., the short films they were doing that I'd seen in festivals. That too. But they were trying to get their animated feature done, and they needed animators, and they'd hoovered up everyone they could find in the Bay Area. And so they were looking further afield, and this is Teresa Gerling, who's an animation director now, but she was not interested in doing computer animation, but she knew I was itching to find some way to take the next step. She said that, apparently they don't care if you even know how to turn a computer on. They just want people who know how to animate characters. So I sent a reel down, and a reel, by the way, which I would never get me hired there today, but at the time, a couple of things. One, they were really desperate to get more animators in there, but also because they were really behind on Toy Story. But also, you have to remember, it was a time when there was not a global industry of training animators the way there is now. Now there are terrific animation schools, certainly all over the U.S., but all over the world. France has amazing animation school. Like they're all over the place. And so there were certainly animation schools then, but not with CG programs that were really up and running yet to any great degree. So there wasn't this pipeline of animators that they could tap into to bring in. And like I said, it wasn't, they weren't specifically trying to find computer animators, but they'd already tapped into every traditional animator, both cell and stop motion, that they could find in the Bay Area who was interested in doing CG at that point. Anyway, so it was just a super lucky break. And, you know, as they say, timing and all that is crucial when you're out there trying to get that break.
Yeah.
And I had good enough skills to take advantage of the lucky opportunity. And the other thing that was funny, though, was that I had thought that my skills as an animator, stop motion animator, which were middling, honestly, to at least in the crowd I was in at Will Vinton's, which had some extremely talented stop motion animators. But I thought that was the entirety of what prepared me to do character animation on Toy Story. But what I learned when I got there was that the motion control camera thing also was great grounding for me, because I never animated anything in computer. But with a motion control camera, you know, you've got a track and a tower as a big robot, basically, with a camera on the end of it. And you have a computer off to the side, and you have a little controller, and you sort of drive the whole thing down to one end of the track and bring the boom down and pan and tilt the camera and set the focus. And you set all those values, and then you go 24 frames or 50 frames, 48 frames, whatever, later in the shot, drive it to a new position and set it there. And the computer sort of does the in-between between those positions. Then you go on the software and you see curves that run between those values for the track and the pan and the tilt and everything. And you tweak those curves or add new little knots in them to pull them down or up. That's exactly how you animate the computer. That's exactly how you animate a character computer to this day.
Yeah, keyframing, and I guess all that discipline of understanding framing and movement as well was really useful in terms of being able to animate in the computer. And so that was the first time you'd ever attempted to animate in a computer, was on Toy Story.
Yep.
Amazing.
Because Vinton's was taking baby steps, understandably. They didn't want to invest in a bunch of expensive hardware at that time before they knew what they were getting into. But they had kind of a partnership with a software company in Vancouver, Washington, which is just across the river from Portland. It's not Vancouver, Canada. It's Washington. And it was a company called Hash, and they made a software called Animation Mentor? Yeah, Animation Mentor. And it was quite a powerful little CG animation package for its time, and particularly for its cost. It was it was like $200 or something. And so they had licenses with that, and they had a bunch of PCs running that, maybe 8 or 9. And they had one Silicon Graphics workstation running Alias before Maya existed. And I was just trying to sort of do tutorials with that when this other opportunity happened. And I never got to animating anything. I got, sort of make a sphere, turn on a light. I was sort of at that stage, and this other thing happened and I left. So Pixar was the first time I animated anything in the computer, and their software at the time, by today's standards, was quite simple and even crude, I'd say. For instance, you didn't interact with the character directly in the screen like you would, now you click, on a rigged character and you just move the arm. Everything was forward K. It was a little techie for animators, but meaning if you want to close the arm, you go to the shoulder, you go to the elbow, you go to the wrist, fingers, etc., rather than just sort of grabbing at the at the wrist and moving in. They did have IK, the opposite of that, inverse kinematics for the feet, but it was a special tool you had to run. It was crazy. And it's funny, too, because even for that period, in some ways, that was a bit old-fashioned, because I stayed at Pixar through the end of Toy Story and for about 6 months beyond, but then ILM, which was just across the bay, was prepping to do a sequel to Jurassic Park, and it had been announced in the trades that George was going to do more Star Wars films, and I thought, wow, if I'm ever going to try and work at ILM, now's the time. I've got a reel of Toy Story shots now, and so I was there only about a year and a half later, and they were using Softimage, and it had IK and all this other stuff, so it felt more advanced, but not in a way that made you a better animator or anything. It just made it a little easier to animate the characters in some fashion. But it was funny because when I was at Pixar, a friend of mine back up in Portland was like, wow, you guys must have like cloth simulation and stuff to keep, you know, the characters from penetrating through props and through themselves and stuff like automatically. And all. I was like, oh no. We don't have any of those things. And I don't think anybody really had cloth simulation then, because I remember on Phantom Menace was the first time I remember ILM really getting into that in a big way. And it was tough because we had to do Jedi robes on digidoubles and some other things like that. Just extremely difficult. And, you know, like Boss Nass's long gown outfit that he wears and things like that. And it was really hard then to do. So looking back, I'm like, you know, I don't know why my friend thought anybody would have that, but he thought if anyone did, Pixar would have it. But we totally didn't. And, but it was great. Pixar was an awesome experience. In fact, leaving there was really tough. It was only because I really, really, really wanted to work at ILM, and I really wanted to do the Ray Harryhausen thing more than the Walt Disney thing, if that makes sense. The visual effects in a live action film path rather than the animated feature path. And then, of course, years later, we made Rango, which brought me back to animated features, but still.
Yeah, I was going to talk to you about Rango, actually. It's a film I've only seen once, but I remember being quite taken aback by the complexity of its look for the time. What year was that? That was
2011, I think. Yeah.
But it was a very, very densely detailed characters and scenes in that. And that would have been ILM's first delving into a fully animated movie, right?
Yeah. It's ironic because when I joined ILM in the middle of '96, they were very keen to create their own animated feature because they knew that if we were going to go down that path, the smart play was to have your own IP. So if the thing was, you were actually, because all the visual effects work was work for hire, but you know, like all visual effects work still is. And so they're very keen to do that. And for a number of years, they had different projects that kind of came and went, but none of them ever quite took off. In fact, there was one that was based on characters from Frankenstein. It wasn't a retelling of Frankenstein. It was, but it was in that world, the same characters. And that one almost made it. We were in production on that, or pre-production. And I was going to be a lead animator on one of the characters. But then, so there was some shakeup at Universal, and they axed that film, whatever, for the usual reasons. It went away. And so then ILM actually set up an animation group, an animated features group, with their own offices. And they tried for a few years on a number of projects to get something into shape, to green light. And then finally, George decided instead to create Lucas Animation as a completely separate thing. So that's not ILM. It's not a part of ILM. It's just a completely separate arm of the Lucasfilm company. And they started creating Clone Wars, and, you know, Dave Filoni came on board and all that. And George had plans for a film which later came out, ended up being called Strange Magic. I think it was called something else back then, but and that was in development for a while. But that also then I think George got focused on Clone Wars and the prequels, or at least the finishing of the prequels. I think that between that and Clone Wars and some other things, he just felt like he was too busy to focus on what was then called Primrose with Strange Magic. But that got resurrected and actually did finally get finished years later with Gary Rydstrom as the director at ILM. Ironically, ILM ended up doing the animation and the CG work. But it was a kind of it had gone through like lots of hands and changes and things, and I never really had much to do with it. I think I helped to animate on a shot or two at some point where I was between projects, and they was like, "Hey, can you take on some shots?" I was like, "Sure." But anyways, yeah. So Rango was really our first project, and our first project that was really just end-to-end ILM. We didn't do story, so in a sense, we were still operating as a service for the film. So it wasn't RIP or anything, you know, or had his own story group down in LA and all that. But outside of that, he was very keen to work with us in a new way, because we'd already done 3 Pirates films with him, and we were used to working with him as the client, if you want to put it that way. I don't like that term. It sounds very business oriented, and Gord doesn't like it either. But he understood that sort of that was the relationship, this sort of client-vendor relationship that is usually the norm, right, with visual effects work. But he came up there very early with a big pile of artwork, and he pinned it all up in a room, and he brought up Jim Burkett, his head of story, and he had us bring in everybody that was at that point targeted to work on the project. The crew, of course, grows over time, but certainly all the heads of department and leads and things into a room. And he did a big pitch for everyone because he wanted to kind of bring everybody in and sort of a big group hug to say, we're all filmmakers. We're making a movie. I don't want you to think of yourselves as the vendor at the other end of some phone call. We are making a movie together. And he's very keen on that shift in thinking, which was, I thought, great. Because it also, I hope, because I'd been telling people that, particularly once I'd become a soup and I'd been able to spend time on set, not just doing the visual effects back at the visual effects facility, but spend time on set. I would tell animators as often as I could, think of yourselves as filmmakers. You are part of the team that are making this film. You're not a visual effects artist at a far distance. Certainly geographically, you're far away from where the filming's happening, but you are an integral part of the filmmaking team. We're making a movie. To me, that's a really important thing, because I just feel like a lot of particularly younger animators who haven't spent any time on set or haven't made films themselves, like live action films, feel very separated from all of that, from the sort of Hollywood of it, if you will. And the good idea of Hollywood, the razzle dazzle, that being on set and the cameras and, lights, camera, action kind of part of it. And I would always tell people, like, no, we are every bit, anyways. So that was a big shift that Gore was also very keen to make on Rango, and everyone just adored that, working on that project. Anyone you talk to at ILM who worked on that film to this day will say that if not their favorite project, and for many it is, certainly, one of the favorite things I've ever worked on. But many people will say to me, I never had more fun on a project. When are we going to do another one? So it was really great. And, it was reasonably successful. It didn't, I don't think it was the highest grossing animated film by any stretch. I think Paramount would probably have liked for it to make more money, but it won the Oscar and it did fine. And I see love for it all the time online, just random memes and tweets about, how much people love that film. And so that's great.
Yeah. And probably, put a rocket up Pixar to a certain extent to kind of continue to up their game, because it did look equal to or beyond their standard at the time, I think.
Well, and, that was one of the things, Gore was very keen to not try to go head to head with the Pixars and the DreamWorks or Disney feature animation, because his way he would say it is, they're great. They're at the top of their game for what they do. Like they've each got a kind of a house style, and it's awesome. Why would we try to compete, in that same there? So they're all over here and they're great. We're going to be way over here. So, he very intentionally wanted his movies. He makes it sound like a choice. I don't think he could make a movie that looked any other way than that. I don't think he could make a movie that looked like Despicable Me or Wall-E or, name Shrek. The easy way to say that is cartoony, but those ones all have super distinct styles, and cartoony can sound like an insult. It's not. I know from experience that trying to pare things down to their essence and do proper animated design is one of the hardest things there is, and to make that successful. But there's an idea that because Rango had a more realistic-ish or photographic look or complex look, that it was that's necessarily more difficult. It's not. It's more expensive, and it can be more difficult just simply in terms of the labor involved, right? But creatively, it's just a similar artistic task to achieve. You know what I mean? Like it's just like painting in realism versus painting something that's very graphic and but excellently executed. The realistic painting might take a little longer, or perhaps, I don't know, but it's not a more valid creative execution, whatever.
Sure.
I think you get the point. But what made the film a great fit for us was, we didn't have a lot of people working in ILM who had done a lot of graphic cartoon style work, but we had a lot of people there who were very good at making things look realistic and detailed. And that's what Gore wanted. And he also, even in terms of the characters, they're very stylized, and Rango himself is quite stylized. He's not a realistic looking lizard, although he's textured like one. And that could be a hard balance to strike sometimes, especially with the characters, was the realism versus the fact that they are stylized, that we need things to read and pop and be very clear and all. But because he wanted the whole world, the dirt on the ground, the wood of, the old weathered wood of the town, the wagon wheels, the dirty glasses in the cantina, all of it to look kind of realistic-ish. And certainly what we started calling, instead of realistic, we started calling it a photographic look. Like, could it actually be filmed somehow? That suited our artists, our texture artists, our modelers, all those folks, our lighting people. That suited them really well. So in a lot of ways, for a first animated feature out of the gate for us, it was a perfect fit. Whereas if somebody had come in and wanted something in, like the Warner Brothers style or anything sort of more in that world, I think it would have been much harder for us to do than what we did on Rango. That said, I didn't work on it, but we did just last year, the year before, the Space Jam sequel, and did a whole bunch of super squashy, stretchy Warner Brothers style classic animation, and the animators had a ball on that, and the riggers got to do really different things and all that. But for us, Rango was like a great sweet spot. And, even in terms of the character performance, Gore didn't want, a lot of most, I'd say, feature animation, particularly the higher end stuff, not maybe the weirder independent stuff, but the higher end stuff comes from a tradition of character acting that's sort of an extension of vaudeville plus kind of Broadway musical, where it's like really strong posing and quick anticipations before movements. And Gore really did not want to do that at all. He wanted this kind of awkward, restrained, like if somebody calls a character off screen, instead of a big, anticipation and look, it's more sort of, and if this is an audio only podcast, I apologize, but
I'll add a description in.
But it's just like a weird little glance and side look rather than a big anticipation and follow through and all that stuff. So that as well was fun for us sure, there were people on the animators on the team who were itching to do really cartoon style animation, because we never got to do that at ILM. We were always doing realistic stuff. But this was kind of a fun sweet spot where we had moments like when Rango backs up to the cactus and against the spines, and it just springs off and defies gravity for a moment. Super cartoon style.
But it sort of earns that moment, doesn't it? Because it hasn't been like that throughout, and therefore it stands out and is funny because of it. Yeah, that's a good movie. I'm gonna have to show my kids that, because I don't think they've seen it. They're at the right age now. Just winding back to when you first joined ILM. You've dreamed since you were 12 years old to work on a Star Wars movie. Did you get to work on the special edition, the 97 special edition, or other stuff going on for you then?
Those were just being finished up. My first project was Lost World, which was happening at the same time. And the special editions were just finally being wrapped up. I ended up getting another crack at it a few years later, though, between Clone Wars and Revenge of the Sith, right? Yeah, it was between 2 and 3. It just, because I get confused, because between 1 and 2 is when we did our first CG Yoda tests, and sort of in between those two projects. Then between 2 and 3, George, because we had this big team built up, and ILM needed to keep those folks busy and gainfully employed between the finish of 2 and the beginning of 3. And so one of the things George wanted to do was to continue with some more fixes and things on the original trilogy. And so ILM was great. We'll put people on that, and that'll keep folks busy. And I went to Rob Coleman and I said, and I wasn't working on any of that. I was on, I forget what I was on then, Pirates, I think, already. But I went to Rob and I said, hey, I never really liked that Java that they did in the special edition. And we have a much better looking asset now, the Java that we created for the pod race.
Mm.
Why don't you pitch George on redoing that scene with the better looking Java? And he's like, okay, I'll do it. Because he was having regular meetings with George on the different things George wanted to fix and stuff that was coming up on episode 3. So he comes back to me a while later. He's like, yeah, he wants to do it. I'm like, great. He goes, you're gonna lead it. I'm like, okay. So it was me and I think it was just 2 of us. I think it was me and Sean Curran, who was the animator friend of mine there at ILM, still very close friend of mine. And I think we split the shots up. I think there were 5 shots, and he did the first 3, and I did the last 2. One of them was the long walk and talk, the stepping over the tail and the long walk and talk. We did the shots, and I had a brainstorm about how to avoid having to have Han step on the tail, because I always thought the joke was a little sus. And then as well, they kind of cut out what they had to do was in terms of cutting out Han to get over the tail is looked a little janky to me. And I thought, well, they'll be able to do a better version of that now, but still, it's like better to not have to do it at all. And the way I saw it is I just thought they were trying to solve a problem, that it wasn't like, important to George. It was just, they were just trying to solve a problem of getting him across the tail, this big tail that we know Java has. So I came up with this thing where Java would start to turn as Han is walking behind him. What you do if you're talking to someone and they walk behind you, you sort of turn and keep your eye on them. And you would imagine then that his tail was sort of dragging with him, and they were kind of almost in a little pirouette, sort of walking around each other. And then, and then they could continue on from there. And Java would just do a full turn, or he'd turn part way and turn back. I forget what the solution was. So I blocked in a version of it, not final animation, and just a version of it. And Rob was having one of his regular reviews with George, and I just sat down in the, a few rows back in the theater, and that shot comes up, and George sits up in his seat, and I never really saw him get cranky with anyone. This is the only time I saw him, and I'm sure people who worked with him a lot more. I worked with him some on Clone Wars as one of Rob's anim soups, and presented a lot of work to him, and I never saw him get cranky there. But I'm sure, he's had his moments, probably more on set where there's more pressure. But this is the first time I ever saw him get cranky in dailies. And he sits up and he turns to Rob and he says, "Why did you take out the hand stepping on the tail? That was my favorite part of this whole sequence. I didn't even want to do this. You talked me into it."
So Rob took the flak.
So everyone's like, "Oh, Rob, I am so says, oh, don't worry about it. He's not really mad." So I redid it with the tail thing, but I reduced a lot. My recollection of the original version of the special editions was he went really bug-eyed and a big on his mouth, and I just took that down to make him look more grumpy than completely shocked. And so that was fine, and that George was okay with that. We got it done, and I do think it looks much better. I mean, I agree with people who say that scene may not belong in the film because we've already received the information from same information, all that. Not arguing that point, but I feel like if it's going to be in the movie, the version we did was better looking. So.
Yeah, I kind of always viewed those 97 special editions as a way of George kind of pushing the technology forward and exercising a need to get to the next step of visual effects. And, I'm not a fan of that Jabba scene either, but I remember being completely transfixed by all the making ofs at the time, which are right, did sell it as this was the solution to a problem, with Han stepping on his tail. So I've some affection for it, I have to say. But, I mean, I'm sure you look now, even at the 04 version, and think, well, we could do a lot better now.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And
that's always going to happen, right?
Like, I don't think we had any subsurface scattering, for instance, on that thing that happens with real skin, where the light kind of penetrates the outer layers and gives it a slight kind of waxy glow. I don't think we had that in our rendering yet. We would have it. If we did, I don't think we used it on that scene, because my recollection in terms of projects I was involved with was that Davy was the first thing I remember seeing. Davy Jones and Pirates was the first thing I remember seeing that as a component of the rendering. I'm sure it existed at ILM prior to that on some other projects maybe, but I don't recall it. Like, I don't remember seeing it in the Mummy films, for instance. I could be wrong about it. They might have had it, but I really remember it and Davy as the first time.
Yeah.
So things like that would certainly improve the look of it, and for sure, yeah. I mean, 2004 was an eon ago.
Yeah. You mentioned about how you sort of pitched the idea to Rob. Was it kind of open like that with regards to those '04 special editions, the Blu-ray, that you could kind of come up with an idea? Because there was like the Ewoks blinked now, and can't think what else was added. My friend Drew and Stuart would know.
I don't think it was common. I mean, I think most of the stuff that got changed was stuff George wanted to have changed. And they would sit down and look at the movie together, and he'd make up a list and that kind of thing. This was just a thing that sort of bugged me, and I just thought, well, doesn't hurt to ask. But it wasn't like it wasn't like common knowledge at the company. Hey, if you got an idea for something to get changed, just pitch,
But you felt comfortable enough to do so, which is great, to your superior, Rob, who then took it to his superior.
Oh, 100%. And the company, I mean, I would say that while that specifically wasn't necessarily a thing, the company itself has always had a very open culture. We talk about it a lot. The ILM culture was always, like in dailies, people are expected to speak up. There wasn't some like hushed hierarchy where everyone shuts up and waits for the visual effects soups to do their thing. Now, of course, if you're having a review with the director, everyone waits for the director to say what they're going to say and all that. And there's certain aspects of keeping your trap shut at certain times, all that. But that goes with any business. But the company generally is very low ego, very collaborative. Those are all sort of hallmarks we've always considered to be kind of the ILM way. It's funny, I remember I was on a flight back from LA once, and it's Southwest Airlines where you don't have to assign seats. So you just get on in boarding groups. And
like a bus,
And I saw Phil Tippett was in line, and I didn't really know Phil well then, and was very excited to see him. I was like, oh my God, it's Phil Tippett. So I started chatting him up, said, oh, I work over at ILM. And that put him at ease, because it wasn't just a crazy fan. It was a crazy fan, but a fan who was working at ILM. So we sat next to each other. We had a really nice chat on the way back up. But I remember at that point I was an anim soup, but I think I was only on my first or second project at ILM as an animation supervisor. And I was talking to him. I was saying, so how do you run your dailies? I said, I like to get people talking in my dailies. I want everybody to speak up. And I think his response was, oh my God, no, you can't do that. The peanut gallery will kill you. And I think what he was imagining was that thing of like not having an opinion of your own. So you sort of ask everybody to like, hey, what do you think? Which I don't think I explained myself very well. But what I meant was, and I still do this to this day on every project I'm anim souping. And unfortunately nowadays, a lot of my animation reviews are Zoom calls. And I'm going to find a way to change this, because most of the Zoom calls I do now are just with the animation soup or lead at the other end, not with the whole animation crew. And I want to change that. I want to get back to talking directly to animators, because I really miss that. But anyways, what I would always do at beginning project is tell the animation team, please speak up in dailies. I have a whole room full of animator brains, and I want, you guys are all looking at the shots and you're going to see things, and I want people to speak up. And, people will be reticent for various reasons. Some people are just a little shy. Some people feel like if they talk a lot about somebody else's shot, then people are going to talk about their shots and give them lots of notes. You know what I mean? There's
a political suicide kind of thing.
Yeah. But, over time, you get everyone comfortable talking, and everyone knows there's an etiquette to it. I mean, if you're seeing a shot that is close to final, that's not the time to say, hey, would it be better if it came in from the left instead of the right? Or, but it is the time to say, the foot looks like it's slipping there a little bit, or there's a little hiccup, a little bump in the animation, right? Little things like that. But if it's first blocking, then it's totally game to say, boy, I think this would be a lot funnier if he paused right there and then did this thing or whatever. And I love that. And then the only other component of that that's really important is that I have to then, after a conversation has been had, I have to bring it back to exactly what we're going to do. Like, number one, people have to understand that I have a point of view, and I always try to make that clear at the beginning, rather than, as I said, rather than just go, hey, what does everybody think? It's not that. I'll talk and I'll have a point of view. But then if people want to talk up, they're welcome to. That's the idea. And then at the end of it, I have to be able to say to the animator, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this. Don't worry about the rest of it. I think, I don't think we need to do those things. Let's just do these 3 things and great. And so they know walking out of there exactly what to do. And that's how I think animation and that's how I like to run dailies. But again, it's kind of, I found the ILM culture to be very much that way. General, that like it's low ego, very collaborative. People don't hide their special sauce. Like when people are working together in the same discipline, I'm told that it could be a problem at some companies where people are like, well, if I tell everybody how I get things done, then they'll know how to do it, and then when it comes time to lay people off, I have an advantage or whatever.
Yeah, people crave their own little islands, don't they? And they're afraid to let people to their shore. So, a question then: you obviously bring animators in and people from your department. Do you ever have people from other departments within ILM to come and review your work? Is there a more open forum that somebody who is a textural artist, will they be there for an animation meeting, for instance?
Sometimes, and it's not like it's forbidden or anything. It's just usually too busy to sit through hours of animation dailies. There are reviews though where we're kind of reviewing everything, and sort of, in other words, there might be some animation shots in there and everyone will see them so they can go, layout can say, oh, you guys are still using the old camera. You got to update your camera. We changed the pan on that. Or texturers can say, well, see, an animation review, they wouldn't be seeing real rendered textures. I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Like one place where it all comes together, for instance, is look dev reviews, where we'll have a character that we're creating and it's just a turntable, right, of a character. Mm-hmm. So the modeling folks are in there to just judge how the model is looking. The texture artists are in there to judge how the textures are looking. The look dev artist who's putting all that together and rendering it is there. I'm there because I might be like, boy, those eyes don't read well at all. When we get into animation, that's going to be a problem. So that kind of thing. So that's one place we all kind of come together. And also, I would say once shots start to go into lighting, after animation, then typically everyone's in there. I go to those dailies, and then texture and model, and everybody's in there because again, they're looking at where you can see everything all put together, and everyone's looking at it. In terms of those folks coming to animation dailies, like I said, not as common because we're using a sort of simplified version of the character with sort of low-res textures and things like that. So they can't judge that work anyways.
And I guess there's potential there as well as sort of infecting somebody else's mind with an idea, or they might think, that's not good enough, or I don't know, I wouldn't have done it that way, before it gets to the point where they need to work on it, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't know. I think if someone wanted to be part of dailies for any reason, even if it was just they're like, I'd like to experience that, or or they might have a more concrete reason, like, well, I'm finding now that if I don't keep an eye on that, then I don't have a full understanding of how the character is being used, and it helps me, blah, 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 whatever the reason might be. It'd be totally fine. Nobody would say no. It'd be, yeah, great, come on in.
But I guess you also, is there not a certain aspect to your work where you want to be able to reveal something that's reached a certain level that you're happy with to people beyond the department to make sure it has that impact?
Not so much within the company, I wouldn't say. I don't usually feel like, oh, it's not ready to be seen. I might, like, as an animator, there are times, and any animator would say this, I think, where you're working on a set of shots and the animation supervisor, myself, might say, hey, how's it going? When do you think we might see those? And they might be like, oh, they're not ready yet. But, Tuesday's review, is that be okay? We're like, yeah, make it, because sometimes you need to get it to a certain level to sell the ideas that you come up with. So for sure, at that level, that happens. There are times when I'm looking at a sequence and maybe the visual effects producer is saying to me, hey, the production is asking, when they might see that, the director's asking when they might see that sequence in review. We haven't looked at it in a while, and I might say, yeah, it's not ready yet. I might do my version of that, where it's like, all right, next Wednesday's review, we're going to show it. And then I'll talk to the animator and say, okay, everybody, we got to have this ready by then. Because I know that things aren't quite in place yet, and the sequence is a little bumpy, and it's not going to sell. And as you say, the worry there is that you show a half-baked idea or a half-realized idea, and they throw out the whole idea because it doesn't really get a chance to live. So yes, that happens sort of between the animators and myself, and between myself and the director, not so much between the animation department and other departments in ILM.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But in terms of talking of expectation, I guess is the word. Going back to something like The Phantom Menace, it's a huge movie. The anticipation is enormous. George hasn't made a Star Wars movie for 15, 16 years or whatever it was by the release date. What was the pressure like working on that show? And, what shots did you work on that you kind of still look back fondly on?
Pressure-wise for me, from where I sit now, seems laughably small, because I was an animator. I started the show just as an animator. I finished the show as a lead animator. I got sort of promoted in the middle of things. But my concern at any given time was just the shots I had on my plate to get done, and that's a pretty small amount of pressure. That said, even at that level, particularly, as you say, for someone who, had this lifelong dream of working in ILM and working on a Star Wars film, and you want to do well, so you put a lot of pressure on yourself, certainly. And we all wanted the film to do well because we're all such fans, and we love George and we love Star Wars and all that stuff. And that's a whole other thing. But just saying that compared to what I've experienced since as a soup, where I have a lot more responsibility for a chunk of the show, it wasn't much pressure at all. And it was super fun. I had done before the film started, between Lost World and Phantom Menace, while Phantom Menace is ramping up, I noticed that there was the pit droid asset was ready to go. And you can see, your listeners won't see it, but behind me there's a cabinet full of tin robots, like old tin wind-up robots. And I love robots generally. So I took the pit droid asset, and I did a little run cycle, and I did a little vignette of one of them running along and tripping and falling on his face, and another one comes running along after him and steps on his head and runs off. And I showed it to Rob, and he goes, "Oh, you like robots? Okay." So he put me on, ironically, not the pit droids. That stuff wasn't ready to start yet. He put me on the destroyer droids, the droidicas, the rolling droids, and that was super fun because they're complicated. And to this day, Doug Chang, when he designs things that are mechanical that way, he designs them to pretty much work. There are some cheats, and we don't really have to engineer it with things like motors and things inside and find room for all that. But in terms of the way the parts slide together and all that, they don't just sort of vanish or scale or stretch or whatever. They're machined parts that slide together and fold up the way. And that's why there's actually quite a good toy of the droidica that actually does.
Right.
You can unfold it completely, and you can fold it back up to the thing because of how Doug designed it. So that was part of the fun of it, was that you could really kind of think it through. The tough part was that it had 3 legs and short little 2-segment legs. And that made it super hard to come up with a walk that looked balanced and plausible. Now, I used to joke about, Doug handing me a character with 3 legs, but I've been working with him a lot in recent years on the Mandalorian series, and at some point that came up, and I was giving him a hard time about it. And he said, I didn't design it to walk. He said it was always intended to just roll into place and pop up and be kind of like a tripod,
Right.
like a gun platform. It gets around by rolling, and then once it's reached its destination, it pops up and starts shooting. And he said, but George wanted it to walk. So I was like, oh, okay. All right, we're off the hook. But so those were super fun. And then and I worked on those with a handful of other animators, but that's where I was sort of like the lead on that. But when I really got the sort of official lead animator designation was Boss Nass. So Rob said, okay, because I did that, the Droideka. Then I was one of the animators working on Watto under Linda Bell was the lead animator on that, and did some shots like the what are you, some kind of Jedi? Mind tricks don't work on me. Only money. Hand gesture. So I did that, a handful of Watto shots, and Rob was pleased with those, and so then he put me on Boss Nass and said, "All right, you'll be the anim lead on Boss Nass." And I had a small team of 3 or 4 animators who helped me with those shots.
And does that mean that you're in charge of everything to do with that character, including his robes and his jowls moving all over the place? And
yes-ish. So his robes, fortunately, as I was talking about earlier, we just were kind of in the early stages of having cloth simulation. So I didn't have to animate his robes. I had to think about them, like when I was posing him, like I had to make sure that his arms, there was space between his arms and his body for the robes, and, things like that. Kind of normal things we think about now. But prior to having cloth simulation, we cheat a lot of that stuff, and we had to start being serious about cloth simulation coming along. But his jowls, we didn't have flesh simulation yet. So fat and flesh and muscle, we didn't have those things yet. So we that was all just an animation rig, and I had to hand animate all that stuff. And so for me, the main part of my responsibility as anim lead was to establish how he moves, how he expresses himself. And we had the voice, obviously. We had Brad Blessed, who's great physical reference for the character. He's a big guy, and he's got a big odd face, and he's very animated generally. And so, but he
swears a lot more than Boss Nass, though.
He does. And we had footage of him. That wasn't all that useful. What was more useful was to look at him from movies and just sort of draw on his general vibe. The reason that dialogue stuff in this is because this often happens when people do dialogue is, they're at a lectern in a little recording booth, and they maybe have their reading glasses on or whatever, and they're kind of looking at the script because they're usually not off book by the time they're doing the recording. And, occasionally they'll sort of look up from the page and actually kind of act it out, but mostly not. So you can't really look at it for exact reference, which is why on Rango we didn't go that route. We had all the actors in a soundstage wearing costumes and holding props, and we recorded them together and shot all that. And we didn't rotoscope that, but we got a lot more out of it as animators than we normally do from a voice recording. But anyways, so we had that from Brian. And so, I animated the first few shots and kind of set a tone for it, and then would talk to the other animators about their shots, and then hand this stuff off to Rob, and then he would present it to George. And that's actually the first time I got to speak to George, which was super nerve-wracking. We had a review, and they were looking at some rendered shots of Boss Nass, and he had said something about the animation, but there was something about the context of the use of that word that made me doubt that he was actually talking about the motion, that he was actually talking about some other aspect of the texturing or something. But I wasn't 100% clear because I was in this session, but I wasn't talking to George. I was just sitting in a row or two behind as he talked to Rob. And then after the dailies, I saw George crossing the parking lot between buildings. And I thought, well, I have a perfectly good work-related reason to speak to the man, and there he is. And so I went over there, and it was unbelievably nerve-wracking. Now, even just a few years later, when I was working on Clone Wars with Rob, and Rob had brought myself and Chris Armstrong on as sort of undersuits to take on sequences, and I had, between Phantom Menace and Clone Wars, had my first opportunity as an animation soup on AI, artificial intelligence. and and that was Steven Spielberg, and so I'd worked on that, and so then on Clone Wars, Rob would just have Chris and I present our sequences to George, and by then I was still nervous about it, but I got on with it, But this Phantom Menace, this first time just going up to him to talk to him about a shot, I was I was vibrating. I was so like, worked up about it. But I went up to him and said, hey, I'm lead on Boss and Ass, and I just had a question about that shot. He said, animation. He's like, oh yeah, no, it's not the animation. It's just, the this, that, and the other, whatever it was, texturing, lighting, some aspect of the thing. And okay, great. And so, and we said, I think that was it. Like, I didn't keep him any longer there or anything, pretty much. But that was my first time getting to ever speak to George, and that was super memorable for me. I'm sure he would, out of his brain the minute he was past me. But
and you got the answer you wanted as well, which is good.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't. Yeah, it would have been awful. Not awful, but it certainly would have bummed me out. Been like, well, yeah, he's like it doesn't feel realistic at all the way he's moving. Everyone, no.
When you employ people, or when people get employed at ILM, particularly in character and animation, we're in a time now where most people, I'm guessing, will have been animating on a computer for some years before they try and get a job. Yeah. Is it still important, do you think, for those people starting out to have the kind of physical skills that you had doing stop motion, claymation, all that kind of stuff, to be able to do what they do now? Is it still important to have that kind of tangible sense, memory?
Yes and no. I would say it isn't essential. I've worked with some amazing CG animators who've only ever worked in the computer. They never worked at cell animation, never worked at stop motion. That said, I certainly don't think it hurts to have other creative experiences like that feed into it, stop motion is just one of many, or cell animation, or live action filmmaking experience, or theater experience, as in, acting. It's a great experience for animators. So there's a whole bunch of things that aren't a requisite, like aren't absolutely necessary, but certainly don't hurt. And even drawing, I think drawing is super helpful, particularly because you can use it to plan out shots before you ever jump into the computer. And I urge people animators who can't draw, I still urge them to at least stick figure out their shot in some form, or write down ideas or something before just hopping right into pulling the character around the computer. But maybe even that's kind of an old-fashioned notion now. But again, if somebody said to me, well, I was thinking about taking drawing classes, but I'd be like, take them. If you have the opportunity, do it. That's super helpful. Sculpting classes, photography, all that stuff is helpful. But it isn't like, if you haven't done that, you can't be a good animator. Right?
Sure.
There's plenty of good kids out there who just only ever animated in the computer, and they're amazing, much better than I ever was. So,
I was also going to ask about, so Lost World, let's say, how much has changed in animation since then? Because a lot has changed in visual effects since then in terms of the tools that are available to you. Like you talked about, the way light bounces off skin and all those extra tools that have been added in hair and fur and cloth and all those things. But with animation itself, is it still kind of at its essence as it was for you when you first started animating in a computer?
Yeah, I talk about this a lot at work. It's shockingly little has changed. When you're talking specifically about keyframed animation, that is animation where the motion is being thought up and created by the animator. So obviously motion capture came along, and so for realistic humanoid characters, we use that now. Facial motion capture has evolved greatly, and there's a bunch of different flavors of that now. And if we did Davy Jones today, we'd be using that, whereas we weren't using it back in 2005, 2006. We were doing animating his face by hand. So those things have changed. But when you're actually keyframing things yourself, and we still do tons of that on, particularly for creatures and things that just aren't human or much too large to have normal human motion or what have you. It's exactly the same. You set keys on the various parts of the creature. You pose it, move along in the shot, pose it again, move along in the shot, pose it again. The computer sort of does the in-betweening, if you will, connects those positions with splines. You go in and edit the splines, because if you let the computer do it, it looks terrible. So you make all kinds of little alterations until you're done, refinements until you're done. It's kind of amazing to me that really has not changed. I don't know how it could change. I mean, there have been all kinds of experiments over the years. There was the dinosaur input device on the first Jurassic Park that enabled the animators who were stop motion animators to animate the dinosaurs that would end up being CG. So they had a physical dinosaur sort of armature to move, and that had a little actuator on it that communicated with the computer. But that didn't last long, because honestly, it was a pretty clunky way to do that kind of work. And once people sort of got on with the business of learning to use the computer and animate the computer, that's a much more direct way to do it. But outside of that, there haven't been, we've tried different studios, and even we have played around with little gizmos that animators can use to sort of block out their scenes. Like if they're doing a fight scene, like we've used those XM suits. They're a kind of motion capture suit, but that don't require all of the infrastructure of a normal mocap setup. So you can do it in kind of small rooms and stuff. And we had an acting room at an ILM. And that was set up for a while, and maybe still was, with an XN suit. So if an animator was, again, doing work that, even if it was ultimately going to be keyframed, but they could plan out a shot just using their bodies, just quickly block out a thing using the XN suits and get poses and things quickly. So we've played around with that, but mostly people still just use the mouse and the keyboard to animate in the software. And we use Maya. I've done for years now. Real-time computing is changing things a bit. It's certainly making it possible for animators to see their scenes in a better state of lighting and texturing and all that. Although we're on the ILM side, we're still nobody's really using that. A handful of people are.
Did you use it for K2SO for 2 shots? Did I read somewhere in row 1? Some real time.
Yeah, and so we have a separate division called XLab that's all real time, and so they do games work, they do ride show work that relies on real time computing, VR experiences, things like that. And we worked with them to get a version of K2SO, mainly just because we know it's coming, and we know it's going to inform our work, and more we're going to be in a real-time environment with our work, but it just hasn't made much inroads for us at ILM into animation. And it's mainly because, like, if we were a smaller shop, like if we were like a little 10-person shop, we could be a lot more nimble, and we could certainly get all the animators set up with the kind of box you'd need for running Unreal or whichever flavor of real-time you're doing. And we could spend some time figuring out how to get all our bespoke rigs and plugins and things that help us out in Maya, an equivalency on the Unreal side and all that. But when you've got a big studio with lots and lots of artists, that's a much bigger ask, and it's a lot more infrastructure, a lot more expense and all that stuff. So we're just slower to adopt things like that. It's always been that way. It's always going to be that way. But we have groups like XLab pushing the boundaries of real-time computing. And also, by the way, they've been very involved with creating the volume, right? The big LED wall, because that's all real-time media that's on there. So those two groups talk to each other a lot. There's a lot of overlap between XLab and ILM. We're right next door to each other in the same complex. And so in that way, real time, I should say, is having a big effect generally on visual effects, just not so far for us as animators in ILM, which hopefully will change soon because there's a lot of advantages to it. I get frustrated with seeing the previews that we get from companies like Third Floor, who has been doing our previews on Mandalorian, and it looks amazing. It just looks beautiful. And our anim renders, anim is just a stage. We don't try to make everything look beautiful. We just try to communicate the animation like this, but it just looks so much less pretty than the previews. Of course, the danger there, though, is if you make your anim renders look too pretty, you end up starting to have lighting conversations with the director instead of animation reviews. So they start focusing on the wrong stuff, and so that there's a danger there. Anyways, but the thing that's for years now, everyone's been saying real time is going to change visual effects, and it is, it's having an effect on various areas, improving our tool sets and our speed and all that. But I think AI is actually
Yeah, I was going to
it's
ask about
really
that.
going to change our future, mold our future in ways that we can't possibly imagine at this point, actually. Um,
Have you seen any of that arriving yet, or any sort of things that are in development that you can talk about involving AI? Because it seems to be affecting just about every industry at the moment.
oh, for sure. Yeah, it's scary and exciting in equal nature. There are obvious things that I think are going to change very quickly. Like, I suspect that soon we won't need to shoot blue or green screen anymore because the AI will be able to detect moving. I've already seen white papers on this and some sort of examples on YouTube of similar kinds of things. It's just none of it's quite there yet for our purposes, not quite clean enough or high res enough for this or that. But pretty soon,
Get there, yeah.
the AI will be able to recognize a moving thing and separate it from its background easily. They already did, with still images, that's become a thing on your phone now. It's like
Exactly, yeah.
yeah. So for moving images at the resolution we need and the accuracy we need and all that, I'm sure it's actually already happening somewhere because I'm not totally plugged into that, but I'm just saying, like, that's an example I can see right away. And things like that, like paint out kind of things and fix it kind of things. But obviously the whole deepfake thing is already changing completely how we do de-aging and the face swapping, and even bread and butter things like when we've had a stunt actor, in a shot and they're close enough to camera that you can see it's the stunt actor, not the actor doing a face swap on them. So that's already changing completely how we do all that kind of work. But what I really scratch my head over is, anytime there's big sea change in technology like this, there's always things that nobody anticipated.
Yeah.
So what I really wonder about is, 5 years from now, what will I be saying? Holy cow, I had no idea we'd be doing this. Well, I mean, even deepfake, and, when it appeared, I was just like, what on earth? Like, what? How does that even, and now I couldn't tell you exactly how it works, but I have a kind of an idea. After it's been explained to me many times how adversarial networks and all that work, I kind of understand it now, but it's still pretty strange stuff. But anyways, before that came along, if someone had told me, oh, by the way, in just a couple of years, here's what you're going to see, I would be like, what, really? So I'm wondering, in 5 years from now, what am I going to be saying to myself? I never could have possibly imagined this. This is insane. Again, both good and bad. So
yeah,
we'll see.
As a last question, because I'm aware we've been talking good hour and 25 here. It's good though. I'm enjoying it.
You have to cut this way down.
No, it's great. It's all good. It's all good. There's often been this need to sort of strive towards photorealism with visual effects. And who was I talking to the other day? Maybe it was Gene Bolte or maybe it was Steve Williams. I can't remember. One of my recent interviews, I kind of said, I wondered if at some point visual effects were going to kind of plateau and then there'd be more interest for directors to kind of create a stylized world that couldn't exist in our world. How do you feel about where do you kind of draw the line between those two, and where does your job at ILM sit between those two things?
Well, I mean, that's one of the nice things about working on the animation end of things is that you can have cartoony animation in the midst of a completely otherwise realistic setting. You can have super realistic animation, but with a real stylized rendering look. There's all those things are really, you can mix it all up. It's true that visual effects remains mostly focused on realism, mainly because, the essence of the job is still to combine our synthetic imagery with film, with live action footage. If the live action footage itself isn't highly stylized, and sometimes it is, there are films that have really heightened stylized looks in terms of just in terms of the lighting and all that. And so that when it comes to the visual effects, we have to kind of mesh into that. But in terms of visual effects sort of reaching a creative plateau, I think that's only limited by filmmakers' imaginations. I think we're always here in game to do whatever. In fact, we welcome that because, as you pointed out, most of our work is photorealistic or what passes for photorealistic. And so when we get the opportunities, like Rango, for instance, to do stuff that's not exactly realistic, it's kind of a weird, stylized version of reality. That's super fun for us. It's great, and it's really just dependent on the filmmakers, honestly, their imagination and what they bring to us. There's a term that's become popular. I hear a buzzword I hear a lot in the rendering community in the last few years, which is NPR, which stands for non-photorealistic, and it's a whole area of rendering looks that's become super hot since a little before. But one of the things that really kicked it off was the Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse,
Yep.
Spider-Verse.
Mm-hmm.
Peter Ramsey, amazing, beautiful,
Incredible.
Look that film had that really took it away from what we're beginning to look more and more real in terms of lighting and texture in animated features, like the Pixar films and Disney feature, especially. We're really getting more and more. The characters were still sort of classically animated looking, but the textures and the lighting and the richness and the photographic feeling of it was getting more and more real. And those guys just went off in a whole other direction with the comic book layering and the dot screening and all that stuff. And the way the characters moved and
weirdly, it had a kind of stop motion look to it as well, didn't it?
Yeah.
I actually watched a stream of it as one of my friends reviews movies, and we were kind of going, "Is this working okay?" initially, because it just had such a stylized look to it. But I soon fell in love with it, actually.
Yeah. And they didn't use motion blur, and they I don't know, it was just amazing, and they had an ethos on the film. If it isn't broke, don't fix it. They flipped that on its head. Their idea was like, let's just sort of disrupt everything, which is amazing because, there's always budget and time to be considered, and you're always being asked to kind of fit into a box, and they just really went for it on that film. It was so inspiring. But anyways, now when I go to conferences that are about animation and effects and all those areas, a lot of it, people are talking about NPR. So you see a lot of projects, short films and other features and things that have really interesting look. Well, Puss in Boots, actually, I haven't seen the film yet, but I've seen a bunch of clips from it and trailers, and it just looks gorgeous. And it's not at all, and it's very much this NPR thing of graphic looks and the stuff. I always used to lament that if you looked at the art of book for a given animated feature, that the design work, the character designs and the environment artwork always looks so rich and illustrative, and you can see the texture of the charcoal on the paper or whatever medium they were using, even if it was digital, sort of emulating that. And then you get to the film, and they all kind of were starting to feel more and more sort of polished and realistic-ish and beautiful, but they didn't have that texture of the thing. And NPR is really bringing that into films. Spider-Verse, Puss in Boots, films like that are just, you look at them and they look like those rich drawings from the art of book. And I love it. I absolutely love it. Now, how that stuff will affect us in visual effects, probably a lot less, because again, you need a movie that was, you need a reason to not have things look real in the midst of a live action movie. But that does happen. Life Aquatic, ILM did visual effects for Life Aquatic, and that wasn't CG work. They did stop motion for some of the shots of the sea creatures.
Yeah.
But that's an example where even though it's a live action film, the director, Wes Anderson in this case, wanted those little moments to be something other than realistic.
Yeah.
This kind of weird little magic to them. And that happens, and that's cool. That's great. We love it when that stuff comes along and we get a chance to do those things.
I said that was my last question, didn't I? We could leave it there, but there was one other thing I just wanted to ask quickly.
Yeah, sure.
You're quite active on social media, and you've become kind of a de facto kind of ILM ambassador on Twitter. People fire questions at you. You kind of dig out information, and
Todd Vaziri is our actual ambassador, Twitter ambassador, but
yeah.
I'm like the deputy ambassador.
The deputy, yeah. Is that a role that you kind of enjoy? It feels like, because I think before we started recording, I said to you, it feels like you're still a fan as much as the fans are. You're kind of on the inside. And it's nice that you're kind of projecting that back out from the inside of the company.
Yeah, it's a bunch of things. One of the things is, yeah, I am a fan, and I like to engage with other people who are excited about the work in the same way that I am. And I feel grateful to be able to share stuff that folks are privy to, and that's fun. The other aspect of it, though, is I really dislike disinformation. I don't mean intentional disinformation. I just mean the wrong story getting spread about how an effect was done or whatever, and completely innocuous. I'm not even talking about malicious stuff. I'm just, it just bugs me when I see like, oh yeah, that was done, blah blah blah. I was like, oh wow, no, that's not all that was done. And I'm not interested in like shaming people or making people feel dumb. I just want to correct things when I see that when I know they're not right, and I'm like, and I know I have the information. I'm like, oh wait, hang on, let me just correct you. And that can sound sort of like the comic book guy on The Simpsons, where you're pushing out my glasses. Well, actually, blah, blah. And I hope I try never to be that guy, but I do. It just gets under my skin when I see it, especially if it's like an oft repeated misappropriation of information that I've seen 100 times. I'm always like, oh no, that's not what happened there. This is, let me explain. And so that's the other part of it, is I kind of hope to bring a little clarity to certain topics that that show up occasionally, around visual effects and stuff. And some people have things they like to talk, like Todd. I ribbed Todd about this, but one of Todd's things is turning motion, smoothing off on the TV, and then of course, and this one that I'm right there with him on, that one too. But this other one is this thing of sort of talking about movies and saying, oh, they didn't use any digital effects on that. It was all done for real. Like that whole world of film commentary, we're both warriors in the fight to correct that when it's just a marketing.
Yes,
ploy.
That's what it is, isn't it? Yeah,
it is. Now there's times when it's a valid thing to say about a movie that, like for instance, Top Gun. It's perfectly appropriate to say, hey, we put actors in planes and we shot as much of this as possibly could for real. But when people say, oh yeah, it's all real, it's like, no. I know the people who did the visual effects. I can tell you how hard they worked on it, and I'm gonna be, it's like, and sure, we'd much rather that there was that the marketing message was, our practical effects folks work together with our digital effects teams to bring you this one. I get that sometimes it's punchier and better to just say, look at these amazing stunts and all that, because the stunts are amazing, and it is amazing when Tom Cruise, like, I love what he does. Actually, I think this whole thing that he does where he gets excited about a stunt and he makes it happen, but then they also publicize it ahead of time. Because honestly, if they didn't publicize it ahead of time, people would just assume it was digital, because that's the world we live in. So you have to publicize it ahead of time. And also it just gets people excited about the movie. And I also understand that on a gut level, if people understand that there was a human person at risk in the middle of this crazy stunt, that's engaging in a way that's super important and vital and primary. And I recognize all that. I agree with it. Like,
so he's managed to kind of regenerate that kind of feeling you used to get. Like, I mean, I think you're about 8 or 9 years older than me, but the feeling I used to get watching those TV specials of, the biggest Bond stunt to date or whatever, and you'd be like, wow, I want to see this movie now. And I think, for all of his shortcomings, Tom Cruise, other parts of his life, I think the man has some genius about him for sure, because he understands the machine of filmmaking perfectly.
He's so dedicated to what he does, and he's so good at it. And but anyways, to me, that's like the good end of that thing of like pushing the practical over. The bad end is there are folks who kind of it feels like they should have just chasing street cred with film nerds by oh yeah, we're not doing any CGI on this film. And they always say CGI instead of just CG or computer graphics or whatever. Or just visual effect, because honestly, that's what it is. It's a whole bunch of different tools, but whatever.
Yeah. Do you know, one of the films that recently I was amazed by was Everything Everywhere All at Once. Some of the simple solutions to things that they came up with, like there's that chef scene and they just kind of punched in a couple of grabs of a pepper and kind of painted in a bit of reflection on it and then keyframed it. Just simple stuff. And that's the thing that is the answer to all of these questions, isn't it, really? Which is, do what is the best tool, that's available to you at the time for the budget that fits within your budget and achieves what you want to achieve. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and we're, those of us who work entirely in CG, nothing makes us happier than to have real world stuff to anchor our visual effects to. So to whatever extent, in terms of cost, time, safety, that things can be done for real and shot on location, we're like, yeah, please do. And then we'll do whatever, you can't do. Because it's much harder for us to do things that are just 100 where everything in the frame is CG. That's the hardest thing to do. It's still necessary a fair amount of the time, but we're happy we love, partnering with physical effects and stunts and all the other departments on that work that we do. It's not an us or them situation.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat there with Hal. Thanks to Hal for giving your time. I really enjoyed chatting with you. I am going to go and watch Rango again. I hope it's on Disney+. I haven't seen it since its release. And I also hope that, Drew, of Star Wars Visual Comparisons, that you liked hearing some more details about the Jabba the Hutt scene. You're very welcome. Next up on the podcast was due to be composer Stu Phillips. Unfortunately, I had to cancel again at last minute because my internet connection was down. Planned maintenance, apparently, but neither me nor my wife knew anything about it. So I hope Stu and I can find another date to chat, but I do fear that I've had to cancel on him a couple of times now. And yeah, that can be annoying for somebody on the other end of it. So apologies, Stu, and I hope we can, as I say, find some time to do it in the future. Yesterday, I recorded a conversation with the legendary Ken Ralston, a visual effects artist and supervisor, Oscar winner, Star Wars alumni, and a name that I've known since I reckon I was about 5 or 6 years old. And it was an absolute treat. So that'll be the second episode of February 2023. After that, I have filmmaker Patrick Reed Johnson on to talk about his film 5/25/77. It's been a long time coming, the film and the interview. And then it's the turn of Van Ling, visual effects supervisor, James Cameron collaborator, and also Laserdisc and DVD producer. I think of that Abyss Laserdisc, which kind of blew my mind when I was a young man. Looking forward to getting into more research on Van in the coming days. Certainly a very interesting guy. Looking forward to our chat. Regarding the Joe Alves documentary, flights to the US are now booked for me and Patrick, my co-director, from our own pocket, as I mentioned before on the previous episode. We have 4 interviews lined up, hoping to arrange more, but it's proving difficult to pin people down. I guess it's quite late on, but this is the only window we've kind of got at the moment to get it done. But yeah, we'll come away with some more interviews with Joe and with 3 or 4 other people as well. So we hope to return home in mid-March with plenty of material to get the edit going in a more concerted, kind of definite way. At the moment, it's a lot of ideas flying around, but we really want to get that timeline going. Thanks as always for your support for the podcast. Thanks to those of you that left a review on Apple Podcasts, which I recently asked if people could do via a tweet. I sent some of you some Filmumentaries goodies for doing that lovely favour for me. And it's amazing to see the effect that it's had in terms of seeing my thumbnail or tile for the episode kind of move up a little bit. So if you can, I appreciate more of that. Please leave a review when you can. And as I say, tell anybody that you know that might be into the podcast. I mean, come on, look at that list of guests. I mean, it's even I'm kind of blown away. Anyway, thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.